All right, gonna get started. Last one again before lunch today. So there's at the end. They're actually going to be recording Billy's presentation. So I think Nicole's going to have mics for the Q&A afterwards. So if you could hold your question until she gets you the mic, that way they can record that. Yeah, the questions too. So yeah, so if you can hold off until. So we're very fortunate to have some great keynotes here at this conference, and this is an interesting one to follow up Mr. Joyce's presentation as far as we went the defending the critical infrastructure to how to declare war on the world and win, which is I'm looking forward to. But it gives me great pleasure to announce our next keynote speaker. It's Mr. Billy Rios, who is a lead security engineer at Google. Prior to that, he worked at Microsoft and was on their security program manager. He is an invited speaker all over the world. He's spoken at RSA, DEF CON, Black Hat, Europe, internationally. He was also invited out to give a presentation at the NATO Security Conference on Estonia, to where they analyzed what happened and some ways forward and things of that nature. So without any further ado, I introduce Mr. Rios. So thank you.
All right, let's get this started here. I'm Billy, and the first couple slides I have here actually just kind of go over a little bit about me, because usually what happens is people see me and they're like, that's a really good-looking guy, but why should I listen to him? And then half the crowd goes, well, he's so good-looking, we should just listen to him anyway. But then the other half is like, we need some creds, right? So from a professional standpoint, I think my career started in the Marine Corps as a company-grade officer. I was a logistics officer in a SIGINT battalion, very interesting. I was commissioned in 2000, left active duty in 2004. Saw a lot of interesting things. And then I went to DISA, actually, to do network defense, intrusion detection, incident handling. Very interesting time to be doing that stuff. And then there's actually a retired Air Force guy recruited me to be a penetration tester. There's no way I could turn down that job. He's like, oh, you're going to be doing the coolest stuff. We worked a lot on banks. It was mid-2000s or whatever. It was kind of just the Wild West. You could do whatever you want. A lot of fun. And then I decided maybe I'm supposed to grow up here and actually work for these bigger companies or whatever, and throw impressive names on your resume or whatever. And I got recruited to go work for Microsoft. I went through their chains there, and I ended up as a security PM at Internet Explorer. So and I love to mention this because I think that's the first time that place gave me a really good perspective, I think, on security. That was really the first time I had to own a product that I had to defend against a lot of people, right? I mean, I know you've probably never heard of Internet Explorer, but it's a small product at Microsoft, but there are a lot of people looking at that software. It's very high visibility, and it's everywhere, right? When I was there, I think there was like 700 million users. So now I'm at Google. I'm a lead engineer. I don't like to do the manager stuff. I like to stay technical. I lead a group of about 10 people. And I run a team that's called Web or Other Product Security. Whoops. We actually created that name. It's really cool. And the reason we call it Whoops is because we get to look at all the externally reported bugs that are reported to Google. So those are the engineering mistakes that Googlers have made, the Google security engineer or the Google development engineers. We get to look at those bugs. And those are really interesting because we get to look at our process to make sure our process is still robust. Is this a process failure, or is this just an implementation failure? Or is a product team having a problem? Or do we just really have a really talented security engineer that we need to hire, right? And then on the side, I'm actually a flight commander at the 262 Network Warfare Squadron. So I fly up to Washington State once a month from California, sunny California, to rainy Washington and Seattle, and I spend a weekend a month doing flight commander stuff at the 262. I meet a lot of interesting people, do a lot of cool stuff. So from an academic perspective, I'm not an academic, as you can see from my slides. And probably from my speech, but I have some degrees. I don't know why they awarded them to me, but they did. So I have a business degree, concentration in information systems, and then I realized, I actually really like the information systems more than the business part. So I got a master's degree in information systems. And then I was like, I actually like the business part more than the computer part. Then I got an MBA, and then the Air Force was like, hey, you really need a master's degree. So I'm at Air Command and Staff School, and getting another master's degree, and I was like, maybe I should try teaching. And so I taught a couple courses actually for the last 3 years at Mercyhurst, cyber threat analysis. I helped write some books. If anyone's ever read my writing, you'd be like, that's no way. But co-author for the top one, contributing author for the other ones. Pretty interesting stuff. But lately we've been doing a lot of ICS vulnerability research. So if you want to verify that, the easiest way is you can just go to ICScert's webpage and just like look for Billy Rios or Terry McCorkle sitting in the back. There's about 25 publicly credited advisories that have our name, very prominently featured. It's pretty neat. We do vendor assistance. We don't like to talk about really who those vendors are, but they're really big vendors. At some point, when ICScert keeps pinging them and saying, hey, these two guys found bugs in your software. Hey, these two guys found bugs in your software. At some point, they find out how to reach us, and they're like, hey, we heard you found some bugs in our software, and we'd like to talk to you. And so we've helped them out in different ways. And I think the count right now is like over 1,000 individual bugs. If you take them individually to ICScert, it's like some ridiculous amount. So, but as we're getting started, does anyone know what this is right here? Can anyone tell me?
The beginning of PGP method.
Yeah. This is an ICS 0 day. That's what this is. So when we talk to ICScert, I'm obviously not going to give you guys the details. I'm sorry. But when we talk to ICScert, we send them messages like this. And those messages contain the details for zero-day vulnerabilities that affect ICS software or ICS components or PLCs, right? And we do this every once in a while. And just use a standard Gmail account. It's PGP encrypted. So if someone were to intercept it, they would see this, right? So, but we know what the details are. ICScert knows what the details are. And the vendors know, right? So after we find a bug and we report it, what we usually do is we try to figure out what that software is used for. And what that usually means is that we go to the vendor's website. And usually the vendor gives us a lot of information because they're very, very, very proud to share their success stories, right? So usually they have a lot of case studies and white papers and a lot of information about how they successfully deployed this software in various places in the world, right? And so we read that stuff because we're interested in that kind of stuff. And vendors are also usually, they get into a lot of detail, actually. So if you look at some of the web pages, they're like, this is exactly what we've done. This is what we can do for you. Look at what we've done for our other customers. And it gives us a really good indication as to what the impact is, right? Well, maybe we try to guess what the impact is based on this sort of stuff. And then a lot of times they like to share who their customer list is as well, right? Especially the biggest names that they have that are willing to be shared, right? So we can just go to their websites and read this and be like, wow, this is pretty crazy. And then usually what we do is we just ping ICScert again and say, hey, you guys know that like there's a lot of people that use this stuff and it's used for boiler rooms and ARUs. I don't know what that is, but it sounds cool. And web supervisors and SCADA, really cool stuff. And they're like, yeah, we know. We know. So, and then we try to get the software. Maybe we've already had it, but we try to see how it works. This is actually the software that we reported the zero-day vulnerability, and this is what it looks like, right? Because we want to make sure that we understand what it looks like, how it works. This is actually pretty neat. I think most engineers, though, will be looking at a screen something like this, right? So it shows how all these components work, what they can look at. Obviously, this is some kind of air system, probably some HVAC that's running in that particular software that we just reported, right? So it makes it real, Instead of you just kind of saying, oh, yeah, ICS, and you're reading this text, and you're reading this very nondescript piece about what the vulnerability is. It's a memory corruption vulnerability in blah, blah, blah. It's a big difference when you start looking at stuff like this and you understand that, hey, people are actually using this out in the world, right? This is real. So, because we keep it real. So keep that in the back of your head. We'll come back to that. I want to jump back to 2007, right? So in 2007, a lot of stuff happened. The iPhone was released, monumental event, right? I'm sure a lot of people have one here. Korea shut down some nuclear reactor. I thought that was awesome, North Korea. There's some earthquake in Lima. Some other stuff happened. People were elected as speaker. Halo 3, Peyton Manning, man, beat my Bears, Super Bowl MVP. Does anyone know what the most critical event that happened in 2007 was? 2007. There was that, but there was something that was actually more devastating than that. Yeah. The most devastating event was Bob Barker quit The Price is Right. So, world has never been the same. But in 2007, there's also a book that was published called A Brave New War. It was published by an Air Force officer. I think he had a degree in aeronautical or aerospace engineering. I think he wanted to be an astronaut and then decided to go to special operations. Did a lot of special operations stuff, I think like counter intel and that sort of thing. And he wrote this book in 2007. He published this book in 2007. So it was about fourth generation warfare, like guerrilla tactics, small units doing a lot of damage, stuff like special operators would probably be accustomed to and seeing, right? And this stuff was obviously very much taking off. So, but there's one piece in the book that really, really grabbed me, right? I think this is probably one of the most famous quotes in the book, actually. And so I'm actually, you're not supposed to do this, but I'm actually going to read from my slide, right? So, the threshold necessary for small groups to conduct warfare has finally been reached. And we are only starting to feel its effects. Over time, perhaps in as little as 20 years, and as the leverage provided by technology increases, this threshold will finally reach its culmination with the ability of one man to declare war on the world and win. Right? And so when I read this, I was like, this is crazy, but this is really cool. And so, and I think he was referring to this in like a guerrilla warfare, special operations type of environment, but I think this is very applicable to cyber, right? So I asked myself, I was like, how does one man declare war on the world and win, right? And so the first thing I came up with was like, well, we have to figure out what war is, right? And so a lot of people was like, war is just destroying as much stuff as you can, breaking stuff, shutting down critical infrastructure, but that's not really war, right? In the most classic sense, when you look up what war is, it doesn't have anything to do with that, right? When you read the most classical examples, it's words like compel and will and policy, right? And those are the things that are war, and those are the things that you need to achieve in order to win war, right? So it's important, I think, people understand that, especially if you're an individual that wants to declare war on the world and win, right? You have to understand that. And so immediately I was like, I know how to do this. I think there's 3 classical tactics that you can use to exploit ICS, because I think Rob is talking about ICS here. I think the first one is to attack PLCs, attack them directly. Sometimes they're on the internet, facing the internet, which is a really bad idea. Sometimes they're wireless. These things are not very robust. They're not really built with security in mind. So what I'm going to do is maybe develop some tactic that attacks PLCs directly, right? Maybe the second option I have that's tactical that I can use is to traverse a network, right? So I attack some guy on the corporate network. I just keep traversing and traversing and traversing. Eventually, at some point, I'll find what we call a pivot, right? And I'll gain access to these items that are kind of peripherals for ICS and control systems and PLCs, and I'll use that as a jumping point to get to the control systems that I want to have, right? These are definitely ways to win the war, right? And then there's some other things that we call non-traditional. Maybe they have a segregated network. Maybe they say that they're air-gapped. Maybe they use a VPN. Maybe they use some cool technology. But eventually this guy's going to connect to the network someplace because they got to get updates. They got to do stuff. They got to check their webmail. And then when they do that, they have access to those systems. Maybe they're going to the vendor's website, which is super secure, right? But there's other people there, and you get them, and you just wait for them to connect back to the network, right? And then I was like, I don't think that's enough, right? I need to figure this out from a more tactical perspective, right? So once I gain access to the PLC, once I gain access to the device, what is it that I need to do, right? So I'm asking myself some questions like, do I need persistence? How do I establish persistence on these devices? Let's figure out how to do that. Do I make a subtle change, or do I make a change that has an immediate effect? Do I do validation of payloads? How do I do that? If I'm putting something on these software, the devices, how do I ensure that my payload is validated, it's going to work, right? How do I do all this stuff? Do I infect peripheral components? What do I do? And then once you figure all that sort of stuff out, you realize that that's not the way to win the war, right? That's not the way to win. So now put that in the back of your head, and we're going to go talk about a different zero-day that affected some different vendor, right? And the vendor is actually not important because there's actually a learning piece for me that happened during this event here that I want to share with you, okay? A couple, actually. So at some point, I had a disagreement with the vendor, right? I was like, I don't agree with you. So, and because we funneled everything through ICScert, we had this rift between me and the vendor, and ICScert was there to try to help us out, right? Because the role that we used ICScert was, as independent security researchers, what we did is we pushed everything through ICScert. And the reason we did that is because we wanted ICScert to be our buffer between vendors who we had no idea what would do to us. We have no idea what if we sent a vendor from an email from our Gmail account saying, hey, I found a lot of bugs in your software, we have no idea what that response is going to be. None, right? The response could be like, hey, lawyer up, get ready. So we decided what we were going to do is pass everything through ICScert, and all the communications we wanted done, we wanted that through ICScert. So at some point, ICScert said, hey, I got word from the vendor, and this is what they're thinking about doing, right? This is what we've heard. And so we didn't like that. And so what we said is to ICScert, we said, hey, you need to go back to these guys, and you need to fix this. And what we realized is that they can't, right? And we'll talk about that in a second here, about why they couldn't. This is why they couldn't, right? This is definitely a conglomerate, but their headquarters is not in the United States, right? In fact, it is not ICScert's responsibility to go and do PR for other companies, to help them do strategy, to help them figure out how they deal with security researchers, to help them understand how they respond to security researchers. That's not their job. That's not their job to do that sort of stuff, right? They're not there to play the middleman for independent security researchers and conglomerates like this that are not based in the United States, right? They have other important things to do, to tell you the truth. And so when we look at a company like this, we realize that it's huge, right? Billions of dollars in revenue, hundreds of thousands of employees. It's very, very impressive, right? And so especially when you compare it against like an individual like Billy Rios, right? It's like, man, you know. The one thing that I do have 2 small children, which I could task, and man, they could do some stuff, right? And basically my responsibilities are like, I got to do what my wife says, and then there's everything else, right? But there is one thing that matched up, and the thing that matched up is we both had websites, right? Maybe we both had followings, people would read our websites and such, and so I was like, you know what, I'm going to fix this problem. So I went onto my blog and I said, hey, been working with these guys for a really long time. We have this disagreement. They're going to go one way. I'd like them to go a different way, right? And then I used some social media, and I was like, you know what? I want everyone to know what my stance is on this recent event that happened, right? And I got really scared. My wife's like, why are you doing this? And ICScert, as a neutral third party, said, hey, you know, this guy did report these bugs to us a long time ago. We made the vendor aware a long time ago, right? I'm like, that's kind of cool. Thanks. And what I realized was the comments that I was receiving, they were really, really strange to me, right? What I was expecting were people like, what the hell's wrong with you, right? What's your problem, right? But the message was in such a way where people were responding like this. They're like, this is awesome. Thanks for letting me know this. You're doing great work for the community. This is insanely bad from the vendor. They said this is all fixed, but I know it's not. All sorts of crazy stuff, right? And I'm like, wow, this is crazy. In fact, at some point, the vendor actually commented on my blog, right? Which I found really strange. But it actually let me know something, and that was like, at this point, when they're doing this, it was me that controlled the message, right? They're responding to my message, you know, and some people call this gaining the initiative. Some people call this the OODA loop because I'm just moving faster than they are. I don't know what it is, right? But I know at this point when they do this, I control the message. They're responding to my message, right? I'm not responding to what they're saying. They're responding to what I'm saying. They're responding to my actions, right? And they went so far as to go onto their public webpage and say, hey, you know what? This is the situation. We're going to fix this next month. And hey, you know what? We'd really like to thank these guys for doing what they did, right? And I was like, that's cool, thanks. And someone told me, they're like, wow, you're like David, you know? I was like, well, you know, better looking than he is, but yeah, you're right, you know? So, but I actually learned a really, 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 really key takeaway, right? And I tried to apply that to other areas. So let's go back to the other 0-day that I showed you at the beginning, right? So I have this thing. And so let's say I want to declare war on the world and win. I have this 0-day vulnerability. The first thing that I want to do is figure out what's this gain me, right? What's my capability? And then I want to figure out what based on that capability, what are my targets going to be, right? What are the best targets that I can find to do whatever it is I want to do, and how am I going to do that, right? So the first thing I would do is just use tools, right? Because if I just start scanning for this across the internet, someone might know, right? If I myself from, like, let's say my home started scanning for this particular software, I might give away to someone that I'm looking for this software, which they would probably guesstimate and say, he probably has some kind of vulnerability for this, right? So I don't have to do that, actually. I can go to a tool that scanned everyone a long time ago and figure out what they're saying to me, just to kind of get an indication as to what the exposure is, right? And so that's what I did. I went there and I was like, hey, let's see what the exposure is for this, right? And it's actually pretty high, right? There's like 12,000 instances of this in the US, almost 1,000 in Canada, some in the Netherlands, Australia, Norway, and those are just the top 5, right? I mean, I'm sure there's others out there in other places. And this is what it's looking for, right? This is exactly what I'm looking for right here. I mean, that signature tells me that that's the money, right? That's exactly it right there. So once I have this set, I can say, hey, there's about 15,000 of these out there. Then you can start picking and choosing what you want, right? So what are you going to pick? What are you going to pick? I think there's some really obvious answers when people can say, hey, you know what? Go after the power, go after the water. I don't know if anyone's ever seen war games at the very end when they're playing tic-tac-toe, and the guy's like, put X in the center square, right? And like everyone's like, oh, I know how to win this game, right? I know how to win. We're going to win this, right? Yeah, but I was like, you know what? Do you really need to do that to win, right? Is that really necessary to win? Because maybe for some reason, let's say the zero-day vulnerability that I have, only dog food manufacturing plants are using it, right? Is it worthless? Is it no good? Do I get rid of it? Do I just discard it and be like, this is worthless, man? There's no way that dog food could be considered a critical asset or critical infrastructure for any place, right? So what good is this if I want to declare war on the world and win? How is this vulnerability good for me if it only affects dog food plants, right? So I'm like, well, let's see, inside dog food plants, what can I target? What's the best target if I can only affect dog food plants? What's the best target? Anyone know? So I racked my brain, right? I'm like, is it the PLC? Should I gain access to the PLC and do stuff? Is it the HMI? Do I go after the HMI? Do I go after this component here? Do I go after the operators? Do I go after, do I take their IP? And then at some point it hits you, right? It hits you. The target is this guy, right? You have access to the dog food factory. The target is this guy. Does anyone know why the target's this guy? He's pretty cute. Because that guy is actually networked to this system right here, this system right there. Those systems are actually interconnected, right? And if I can affect that system over there, I can influence and affect this system over here, right? And that's the tricky part, right? The tricky part is not finding the 0 days. Trust me, this is not the tricky part. Finding this stuff is not the hard part, right? This is just the beginning of it. This is the beginning of the whole chain, right? The tricky part is understanding, like, how do I use this to affect whatever it is that I need to affect, right? And what are those links? Because some of the links are very, 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 very obvious, right? When power, water, sewage, those are really, really obvious links, and you know what the effects are immediately, right? But some links are not obvious, right? But they're there. They're there, and they're in front of you. And it's really, really, really dangerous to ignore those. So, because that's the end, right? That's what I want to affect. I don't want to turn off the plant. I don't care about that, right? And I really don't even care about the puppy, as cute as he is. I'm just using the puppy as a pivot point to gain access to this network, right? And that's all I'm trying to do. And that's the last piece of the puzzle for me, right? So I don't discard that 0 day that only affects dog food factories, right? Because I know that's valuable, because I can see the links there, right? And maybe, maybe we don't have a young, marine company officer having to think about stuff like that, but someone should. Someone needs to think about those links, and how they affect each other, because there's a lot of connections. So this is the point where I'm supposed to take questions, but I learn, and what I realize that when the question slide comes up, what you're supposed to do is go and sit down real quick. So I don't know if I can answer any of your questions because there's a lot of smart people in here, but I'll try. So, and keep in mind, I think the questions are going to be recorded as well, so they better be really good questions.
Bill, I got a question for you. Your title is How I'm Going to Win. But I do teach Clausewitz. I can talk about the terminology you got in there. It gets back to the issue of why. What's the objective? What's the intent? You haven't answered that yet.
I think you're absolutely right. So I was trying to answer that, actually. So I think a lot of times we don't look at the intent. And what we actually focus on is the technical details, the zero-day vulnerabilities, the technical pieces of it. Oh, what does this thing gain us from a technical standpoint? What does this gain us? What kind of control? What do we control? How do we do this? What are the bits and bytes? And the reality is that it's not always that. That's not always your intent. That's not always your goal, right? That's just one piece of it. In fact, that's the easy piece. A lot of people are like, that's the difficult piece. We need zero-day vulnerabilities. We got to buy these things. That's the easy piece, right? I got an email inbox full of these things, and I'm giving them away to DHS for free, because to me, that's the easy piece. The difficult piece is what you just said. It's like, how do we use this? Because this is just one cog, right? And at the end of the day, we need to get over here. And drawing those connections together, how you get over there, that's the hard part, right? That's the hard part. Yeah,
Well, I'm just fascinated by the fact that you want to affect people. And it occurs to me that one of the goals of ICS attacks by an adversary might be to influence a society not to engage in actual warfare, get what they want. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a professor in here that refers to that as information war as opposed to cyber war. Mm-hmm. Well, tell us a little more about that.
I gave an example of influencing people, but that may not be your ultimate goal, right? In some instances, your ultimate goal may be more technical. Maybe in some instances, your ultimate goal is to literally destroy some piece of technology, right? And if that's it, I think a lot of times those maps are much more easier to draw as opposed to I need to influence something that's not a computer, right? But they're all connected in some way, and they influence each other in some way, right? So, yeah.
So while you were talking, I leaned over to Dan here and said, it's all about the targeting. It's always all about the targeting. Okay, so you worked at Google, you worked at Microsoft, you worked on the technical side, looking for vulnerabilities. Who in your organizations worry about exploiting vulnerabilities once they're found?
Inside our organizations?
Yeah.
Okay. There are people that worry about that. So,
do they talk to the technical people?
Yes. So those conversations are usually not. Actually, there's one thing I can very easily talk about. So we had this bug at Google. We had this issue at Google. We realized that these Gmail accounts were getting hijacked. Right? That happens every day because people get phished and that sort of things. But we do analysis, right? We want to understand exactly what's going on before you just dismiss it as phishing, right? And so what we noticed was, for some reason, there's a high concentration of people from a certain geographic area, right? And then it starts becoming more interesting. And then we noticed that those people in that geographic area, some of them had email addresses that looked like they were probably part of dissident or activist groups. So that makes it even more interesting, right? And so now we start to look to make sure that is like, did these guys get phished? Are these guys' machines already compromised? Is there some other thing that we need to know about? And we realized that it was a zero-day vulnerability in Internet Explorer that was being used against Gmail users, right? And so that's one instance where we had to actually break it down and understand what was going on here, right? And the reason I can talk about that is because at some point, Google went public with that on their security blog, right? So, and I think my name's actually on that blog because I helped with that investigation, right? And they said, hey, you know what? We have this. It's targeted. It's against activists. It happened in this way. It's a zero-day in Internet Explorer. We don't like this. And they threw it out there, right? And then that's when I back away, right? Because I'm a tech lead, and I don't want to get into the manager stuff. So, but it's a difficult problem, right?
So that's the interesting problem with as a corporation finding out that and having to go back to if it's another country or something. Can you speak to the relationship there? Because now you got a corporation going back to maybe another country or dissidents versus military or national security. So can you speak to that just a little bit?
I can. So a couple of months ago, I was at Marine Corps Command and Staff. We talked about this problem. So when that happens to you, right, and you're guessing, there's no way you can obviously be sure all the time. But so the wording was pretty carefully chosen, but at the same time it was very pointed. And so basically what the blog post says, it's public. It says, hey, we think this is sponsored by Chinese groups against Chinese activists. So you can draw your own conclusions from there, right? And so I think the next day, one of the state-sponsored newspapers, like, it basically said, you should shut up to Google, right? Not to me, but hopefully it wasn't directed at me. But it was basically like, you should shut up or you're going to face repercussions. And so there's actually a lot of folks that I work with at Google that have military backgrounds, been in a lot of different places. We sat down, and we had some guy from, we had a professor, a graduate professor come up, an expert in Chinese culture, and we were like, what is this? Because we're looking at the response. Like, first they're telling us to shut up, or we're going to face repercussions. What does that mean? And then later on in the response, it was like, you're just an arm of the US government anyway, basically. Right? And so, like, what does all this mean here? And so, and I don't know if this is, I mean, this is just, some conversation that we had with someone who maybe understands the space better than us, but they basically told us, like, hey, you know what? If you grew up, like, in a communist society where everything was kind of state-owned all your life, it's kind of more difficult to have a perspective to understand that things maybe aren't owned by the government. And so when they see things operating in some certain way, their perspective is probably a lot different than ours, right? So maybe they honestly do believe that, right? But the other difficult piece is like, who do we go for help, right? Who do we call to help us? And this was the message that we kind of delivered at Command and Staff. Like, who do you call, right? And at that time, there was no one that we could call. Because everyone that we called is like, dude, you're some Fortune 500 company, right? Come on, get out of here, right? And so the way Google approached that was they said, hey, you know what? What we really need is an A-team. We can't find it, right? We see their commercial on their little tagline, if you can find them, maybe you can hire. And so what Google tried to do is just hire their own. They just build their own, right? Like, they just try to hire the most talented security people they could find and just bring them onto the team. Let's build this thing. Let's build it out and do it, right? And I think a lot of Fortune 500s are doing that. I think Terry and I were having this conversation the other day. He's at CanSec West, and it's like every Fortune 500 company is coming up to him and saying, like, do you need a job? Come on, come over here. So it's a tough problem, though, right? So we still don't know who to call.
I guess the first question I have is more in reference to, I'll give you a little context first. I was in a group of people having a smart conversation as part of this distinguished speaker event. And some of the smart people in the room decided, when we're talking about SCADA security, what are we talking about? And the first thing that came up was, if an actor or someone, if you're securing a SCADA system or a distributed control system from a threat actor or something like that, what are some of the things that what's the intent, what's the capability? Right. And the discussion went on, and point of the matter was, is someone actually presented the idea that a malicious actor that has access to a SCADA system or a distributed control system is has malicious intent to either at some point in the future to disrupt or degrade the actual process that's being controlled. And then someone else smart in the room said, that's interesting because, like, at a corporate level or the operational DMZ level, you have the data historian that really does contain that actual proprietary information. So you've actually separated your systems with security precautions of NIST standards, et cetera, and recommendations, and that's great. But the proprietary interest of someone or someone that wanted to impact diverse systems is going to either access it through that SCADA system to the operational DMZ, to the data historian, whatever the server may be. The question I have, and it's an interesting spin that you've provided here, is that when you've accessed and you got exploited a vulnerability and you're in the system, so to speak, and you want to have either malicious or have some sort of disruptive or degrading impact on the infrastructure, the point of the matter is like you said, the link, what your target is. Right. If your target isn't to impact the process, but instead to actually access that proprietary data on the corporate level, or even to access the corporate level from an exterior source, is that something? Was that kind of the point? Was to say that once you're connected, once you're in the system, you're in the system, and it's all of these interconnected systems to that system, and maybe not to just target the process.
Yeah. I think the point was more of like, I think everyone's target is different, right? And so, but I also think that a lot of times we do focus on things that we've seen before. And we kind of just use that as like our guiding stick, which is good, right? And so a lot of times we see a lot of intellectual property theft, right? And so we're like, well, how does someone leverage this to do IP theft, right? And what happens is people start building these models to do that, and it becomes very easy for people to understand, right? And what's a little bit more difficult to understand is how some piece of infrastructure that's not classified as critical infrastructure, how that actually links up to something that could have dramatic and catastrophic effects, right? Or just have an influence on things that you just wouldn't expect, right? Because I think those are the very interesting pieces that we find when we do assessments, where you gain access to these systems that seem like they're just not important, right? But in reality, they're connected, right? And from a technical standpoint, I think penetration testers, especially good ones, they understand that, But there's also other layers that are involved as well, right? So there's I refer to them as other systems, right? But people are interacting with those machines. People are relying on the output of those machines. Whether those machines are driving the creation of dog food, and now they're scared to go to the store to buy dog food for their dog, and then now they're doing something else, like those are all linked, right? Those are all connected. Whatever your intent is, I don't know, But I think if you're an operator, maybe you should understand that stuff. And if you're a defender, you definitely need to understand that stuff, So.
I want to complete Bob's question. I don't need a mic. I come from the Air Force, and Bob used half of a phrase that we used. Air power is all about targeting, but targeting is all about intel. What you're seeing, I think, is a vast amount of intel gathering. But what I don't have a good handle on yet, and I want to ask you about, is how much of that intel gathering that you're seeing is aimed at grabbing information, which is fundamentally different than targeting, so that someone can malevolently do something to you.
Yeah.
I don't worry about the first part. I worry about the second part.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. Like I don't think I can answer that question, but not because I don't want to, it's just because I don't know, right? But you're right. There's a lot of intel that's getting gathered, and that's a good foundation to have if you want to take it to the next level, right? So.
Got to have that to do the other stuff
Right.
we're talking about.
Yeah.
Billy, thank you very much.
Thanks. Appreciate it, man.